start recording now. Okay, so we are continuing the Baroque era today. We're going to listen to a couple of pieces from some early Baroque composers, early to middle Baroque composers, and then spend the rest of the period talking about J.S. Bach. And then on Wednesday, we will finish up J.S. Bach and talk about George Frederick Handel, and that'll be the end of the Baroque era. And we'll have our test on Friday, our exam on Friday. Now, speaking of that exam on Friday, I do need you to pay attention to this one, especially if you are in class. I will not be here on Friday morning. I have a specialist appointment, so you are going to have to take that test on your own, either using the webcam from home, like many of our Collaborate folks have been doing, or if you need to have it proctored so that you're not using the webcam, that's fine. We just need to make other arrangements for you, okay? So one of the options is that you can come in on Thursday during my classes and take the test. I don't usually have very many people in my Tuesday, Thursday classes show up during those times to take the test. So if you have that slot available for either the 9:25 slot or the 12:55 slot on Thursday, you are welcome to come in and take the test in class during that time. That's perfectly fine. Otherwise, you will need to either send me an email so we can schedule a time for you to come in and take it during my office hours and have it there available. You can come in at 1 on Monday if you want to take it during that time, if you've got that time slot open. Not on Monday, on Friday. I will be back by 1. So if you want to come after lunch and take it then, that's fine. Or you'll need to get it arranged with testing services to be able to get the test proctored there. Okay, and if you do that, you'll need to send them an email. You'll need to send me an email because I'm actually going to have to send the password over to testing services and let them know that it's okay for you to go and take the test over there. Okay, so if you are somebody that needs to take it in person and be proctored rather than using the webcam, the Respondus Monitor webcam, and take it at home, just shoot me an email. It's no big deal. I'll get it worked out for you, even if we have to do it sometime next week. Okay. Just please let me know ahead of time rather than waiting until Monday or Tuesday or next week to say, oh yeah, I need to schedule to take that exam with you. All right, so that is for this Friday. And that'll be exam 3 on Friday. And then you'll have 3 weeks before the next exam. So we're stretching it out even further. The Romantic era has something like 20 chapters or something in the book. It's a longer unit. There's a lot of composers in the Romantic era. So we're going to spend 3 weeks on the Romantic era before we get to that test. So you've got a little bit of a stretch there. And again, the listening assignments and the regular assignments for the Romantic era will be divided into different sections. Or the Classical era, sorry, that's what's happening next. Will be divided up. Okay, let's talk about the Baroque sonata. So in the Classical era, the sonata form is going to really take shape, and it's going to become its own thing, its own form that we talk about, much like we talk about with the fugue or ritornello form that we've talked about today. And we'll actually go into a lot of detail about the sonata form because it's a very important form in the Classical era. In the Baroque era, we do have some pieces of music that are called sonatas, but they are not technically sonatas by today's standard because they don't use the sonata form. All right, so the Baroque sonata kind of has its own characteristics that I want to look at. These are instrumental works, generally multi-movement works for anywhere between 1 performer and 8 performers. So sometimes it's a sonata for harpsichord that's just played by 1 person, or a sonata for guitar. There's a lot of lute and guitar sonatas written in the Baroque era that are really quite beautiful. And the most common one that we see is the trio sonata. Okay, and the trio sonata is actually kind of a confusing name because they're actually played by 4 people. The trio sonata is written for 3 parts. But one of those parts is the basso continuo, which is performed by 2 people. We talked about that last week, where you would have a cello or a bassoon, some kind of bass voice playing the low part, and then you would have a keyboard or a lute or a guitar instrument playing the chords over the top of it, and then you have your 2 solo voices, whatever they are, for that particular piece. Okay, so that's the most common one. The trio sonata has 3 written parts, but it is performed by 4 different people. And we divide our Baroque sonatas into two categories. Basically, are they church sonatas or are they chamber sonatas? The church sonatas are typically more dignified, and we refer to them as sonata da chiesa, which is basically just means church sonata. And they're the more formal sonatas. The sonata da camera, which is the chamber sonatas, are usually more dance-like. They were more written for entertainment. These would be your after-dinner music in a Baroque court, would oftentimes be the chamber sonatas. And these became popular in the middle of the Baroque era and through the late Baroque era. And one of the composers of these sonatas is Corelli, that we're not going to dive into a lot of detail about, but we do want to mention him here. He was a violinist who spent most of his time working in Rome, spent most of his life in Rome as a composer and a violinist, writing both church music and secular music. So the piece of his that we're going to listen to is a piece of secular music, this trio sonata in A minor. This is, again, a multi-movement work written in 1689. It's 4 movements long, and all 4 movements have the same key, which is rare. As we get into the classical era, we're going to see that composers will shift keys in the different movements and then come back to the main home key at the end. But this one is all written in A minor. And while it's 4 movements long, they're very short movements. We're only going to listen to the first movement, and it's only like 45 seconds long. It's a very, very brief piece of music. The whole 4-movement piece is less than 5 minutes long. So a pretty short piece. It is a trio sonata written for basso continuo and 2 violins as the solo instruments. The first movement that we're going to listen to is in quadruple meter. It predominantly uses a lot of dotted rhythms, meaning instead of straight ahead dee da 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 da, you get a lot of da dee da 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 da, and that kind of drives the first movement along. You have that rhythmic drive through the whole thing. It is homophonic. We do have a melody played by the first violin, but all of the other voices are really just playing in harmony with that main melody. They're playing the same rhythms most of the time, developing those chords for to support that melody. Okay, so here is the first movement of Corelli's trio sonata in A minor. And that's the first movement. All right, very short little 45-second movement, and then it moves on to another style. Yes?
When it's asking what is the instrumentation of the piece, is that like violins?
There's 2 violins and a basso continuo.
Okay.
Yeah. 2 violins and the basso continuo instrumentation there. Okay. Next up, we have an important composer, probably the 3rd most important composer in the Baroque era, underneath Handel and Bach, and that is Antonio Vivaldi. Vivaldi is a very, very popular composer. You hear his music all the time. We had a resurgence of Vivaldi's music in the 1940s and 50s when records became very popular. People could finally get a hold of recorded music of classical and Baroque era pieces and listen to them at home. So there were a lot of recordings made of Vivaldi's music, and they became very popular for people to listen to at dinner and for parties and things like that. We also hear his music used in TV shows, in movies a lot of times. And the one that we're going to listen to from him is probably the most popular of those, easily the most popular of those. So Vivaldi was an accomplished violinist. He was a virtuosic violin player, very, very good, very talented violinist, and was famous throughout Europe for being this great violinist. And he toured and performed, and he also wrote a lot of music for himself, music for him to perform. And then he also wrote some music for other people to perform as well. So outside of that, though, outside of composing and performing, he did some really great work at this orphanage in Venice, this girls' orphanage in Venice, where he taught music. He spent his time volunteering as a teacher for these girls. He put his own money into helping develop an orchestra at this orphanage and teaching and kind of helping to give these girls a life outside of the kind of misery of being an orphan in the Baroque era. And the biggest problem with the orphanages was that they didn't really set you up for success outside of the orphanage. So once you outgrew being in the orphanage and you were an adult, you would kind of get thrown out on your own. And most of the time, these young women would end up working as servants or having these very low-level jobs. They weren't able to really move beyond that kind of orphan status for the rest of their lives. But what Vivaldi did was to teach these girls how to become musicians and really focused and was passionate about that. And these girls received a great education, many of them becoming professional musicians after they left the orphanage, which was huge. I mean, being a professional musician was a really good career path for people in the Baroque era. And for these girls who grew up as orphans to suddenly be well-educated musicians by the time they left, that was huge. It really bought them a new life. And Vivaldi was heavily recognized for that, for being just a very kind person and a great teacher for these girls. He wrote about 450 concerti grossi and other instrumental works in his lifetime, a very prolific composer. But his most famous piece is his violin concerto, the Four Seasons, at least his most famous piece today. It's the one that we hear most often. So this piece was written about 1725. It is a violin concerto, meaning that it features the violin as a soloist, which makes sense. He would write something to feature himself. And it does have an orchestra as the other performers in the piece. And you'll notice in the video that we watch that the main violinist, the feature violinist, stands kind of in the center and the rest of the orchestra is surrounding him. So it's obvious that he's kind of leading the piece there. So this piece is a 4-movement piece with each movement being based on a season, starting with spring. So our first movement here is La Primavera, which means spring. You may recognize that from Ecco la Primavera, Spring Has Come, that we listened to in the medieval era. The first movement here is Allegro and is in ritornello form. And each section of this piece kind of is designed to sound like springtime. It's designed to give you the feeling of spring. We have our main theme, which you'll probably recognize. I would assume you've heard it before. And then you have these little sections that are broken up. And the first one sounds like bird calls. You'll hear the violin doing this kind of bird call sound, and the other orchestra members answer that. And then you have one that sounds like a babbling brook or a spring running through a river of some kind. You can just kind of imagine in the springtime just sitting out by a river listening to it flow through. And then the third little section is a thunderstorm. It sounds like a thunderstorm, which is pretty typical of springtime. So here is La Primavera from the Four Seasons. Here's that kind of babbling brook sound. Did you recognize that one? I've probably heard that tune before. We got into a little side discussion last period about children's shows that use these, and as somebody said that they recognized it from the Barbie Swan Lake videos from when they were a kid. I brought up the Wonder Pets that many of you grew up with, I'm sure. Well, yeah, my daughter used to watch Wonder Pets, and I was always funny to hear all the classical music that they used throughout those. Okay, so that brings us to J.S. Bach, Johann Sebastian Bach. So we're moving out of Italy for a change here in the late Baroque era. Bach is a German-born late Baroque composer who spent most of his life in Germany and Austria, working, and in fact spent a large portion of his life, 27 years, working as the music director for St. Thomas's Church in Leipzig. So that position is probably what he's most well known for. You can actually still go and visit that church and see the organ that Bach played every Sunday morning, which is pretty amazing. And that's kind of a big trip that musicians do that travel. We always go to Europe and go to Germany and check out these areas where the major composers worked in Germany and Austria. And going to St. Thomas's Church is generally a point of destination for us. I haven't been yet, but I've only been out of the country twice, and the only time I made it over to Europe was for a convention, and I was kind of stuck in one place and didn't get to travel around too much. So he was very well known for being a very religious man. He was a church organist. That's what he did most of his life. He was a Lutheran, so the Lutheran Church was kind of the first break out of the Catholic Church in Europe, so the first of the Protestant churches during this time period. The Lutheran Church, the Anglican Church, the Presbyterians came shortly thereafter. But he did work in both sacred and secular positions. We talked about that a little bit. The Brandenburg concertos he wrote while he was working as a court composer. But most of his music that we know today, that we're familiar with today, was church music, with the exception probably of the cello suites that we listened to earlier. And we're going to talk about his church vocal music here in just a minute. Even a lot of his instrumental works were written as for church music. A lot of his fugues were written as preludes and postludes for church services for him to play on the organ. He did have a very large family. I mentioned earlier that he was married, I think 8 times is what I've read. He had a lot of kids, a lot of grandkids, a lot of nieces and nephews, and had a very large family. There's a lot of Bachs out there, and many of them became composers. J.S. Bach is the most famous of the Bach composers. The second most famous is a classical composer, one of his nephews named Carl Philipp Emanuel, CPE Bach. You may have heard that before, but not anywhere nearly as popular as Bach and as well known as J.S. Bach. Let's see. He was known for being a virtuosic organist, as it says here. He did write in every form that was popular in the Baroque era except for opera. He never wrote an opera, but he wrote in every other form and was really a master of those other Baroque forms, and is recognized for being a technical master. his fugues are what we consider to be the high point of polyphony in in music history, and that complex polyphony combined with his phenomenal use of harmony is what really laid the groundwork for modern composition. To the point that we study, composers and musicians study Bach's music heavily throughout college, throughout our education. We not only play a lot of Bach music, but we study a lot of Bach music, and we even learn how to write in the style of Bach. Even students that are not studying composition, music majors are all required to take music theory classes, and part of those theory classes is learning how to write in four-part harmony in the style of Bach's chorales. If you take AP Music Theory in high school even, you have to learn that. That's part of the AP Music Theory test, is writing in the four-part voice harmony of Bach. So very important to the composition world today. So we're going to start with a couple of instrumental pieces from Bach, one from the Well-Tempered Clavier and one orchestral suite. So the Well-Tempered Clavier is a book of pieces that Bach wrote for an instrument called the clavier, which is kind of in between the harpsichord and the piano. So it was kind of a evolution of keyboard instruments leading up to the piano. So Bach wrote this study for it where he was playing this instrument and learning all the cool things you could do with it. This book, the pieces from this book are most often performed on piano today, and sometimes on harpsichord, which is kind of the closest thing that we have to the clavier. But they are very, very famous, and they're studied. I have the book, actually both of the Well-Tempered Clavier books in my office, and I've used them to study pretty regularly because they're genius. They're just brilliant pieces of writing. So the idea here, Bach was known for writing in cycles. He wrote, he would say, I'm going to write a collection of music. And he wrote his 6 unaccompanied cello suites that are all 6 movements long. He wrote this Well-Tempered Clavier book, and the way that this works is that he wrote a prelude and fugue in every major and minor key. And then he did it all again. He actually wrote a second book. So if you add that up, there's 12 major and minor keys, because he didn't repeat. He didn't do C sharp and D flat because those are effectively the same. So 12 major and minor keys, and a prelude and a fugue for each of those. So that's 48 pieces in the first Well-Tempered Clavier book. Okay, 12 major, 12 minor, and there's 2 parts to each one. And then he wrote a second book doing the same formula, following the same formula. So there's actually 2 Well-Tempered Clavier books, each made up of 48 pieces. These are very, very well known. Some of them are more popular than others. The one we're going to listen to next is the Fugue in C minor from Book 1. So this is Fugue 2 in C minor, written somewhere around 1722. And it starts with this basic subject. Nope, that's not right. I think that's right. And it is a fugue because, so that's the subject, and everything grows out of that. We have all of these different parts that are repeating that melody and taking that melody and moving it around and doing all kinds of cool stuff with it, because that's what you do in a fugue. And as is customary in the Baroque period, even though the piece is in C minor, it does end with a C major chord. So this is another one of those animated videos like we had with the Little Fugue in G minor. The second instrumental piece from Bach that I want to look at today is from his orchestral suite number 3 in major. So these were written around 1729, 1731, moving a little bit later in the Baroque era here. So this is, again, a suite, as we mentioned earlier. It's a multi-movement work based on dances, usually preceded by a French overture or a prelude. So that is the case here. So we're actually starting with the second movement, which is based on a dance, based on an air. Okay. This piece is written for full Baroque orchestra, which actually includes trumpets. That's not always used in the Baroque orchestra, and that was more of a classical thing to do. But they were used in many of the movements of this piece, although they're not used in the second movement that we're going to listen to. So the second movement is a very slow piece. It's serene and lyrical, and it's scored for just the strings and the continuo. So the harpsichord, basically, is most often what it's performed on. So this is the second movement of Bach's orchestral suite in D major. Okay. And so we got about 10 minutes. We'll go ahead and finish off Bach. That way all we have to talk about on Wednesday is Handel. That'll be a pretty quick and easy session for us. So the last two things I want to look at here for Bach are some of his vocal music, the Bach chorale and the church cantata, which are two forms that he really mastered in music. So the chorale is part of the Lutheran church service, kind of like the Mass is part of the Catholic church service in music. So the chorale is a congregational hymn, usually set to German texts. So as opposed to the Mass, which is the kind of the hymn songs of the Catholic Church at the time, those were usually set to Latin. The chorales were set to German texts. So these are the hymn tunes. And a lot of these chorales became the basis of the hymns that most Protestant churches sing today. There's a lot of these hymns that if you grew up in a church that sang hymns, you're probably familiar with at least the melodies of them. And some of them were actually written by Bach. A few were also written by other people. But Bach was really a master of the chorale. And a lot of his chorales are still used today in choirs in high school and college. They sing his chorales regularly. A lot of times they'll sing them as warm-ups. Bands, if you were in band in high school, you probably played Bach chorales as warm-up pretty regularly. They were used, everybody uses them as warm-ups and tuning exercises and things like that.